Hello, fam. How are you?
I'm doing great. How are you doing?
Very well, thank you. So, for all the folks who have just joined us, I hope you had an opportunity to look at the marketing that we posted on social media. But our wonderful guest for this afternoon is Pastor Andy Oliver with Allendale United Methodist Church. And one of the main reasons why we have Andy on as our guest this afternoon is because we want to talk about religion. We want to talk about leadership. We want to talk about social justice. And given the work that Andy does in the community, we felt he would be able to offer some wonderful insight around the space of what faith leadership looks like and faith fellowship looks like, especially in the realms of social justice. Andy, would you like to say a few words and introduce yourself to and your congregation to our
Yeah.
viewers today?
First, Samir, I just have to say that when you named all those things, I look to you. Like you're one of my teachers and one of my you're who I want to be when I grow up. I look to Community Tampa Bay. You all help me be a better pastor and us be a better church, and so I'm just real appreciative of just the opportunity to even be in the same space and to be in solidarity with you all.
Thank you, fam. The feeling is mutual.
Yeah. So my name's Andy. Pronouns are he, him, his. I'm pastor at Allendale United Methodist Church in St. Petersburg, Florida. I wound up here after serving a couple churches and taking leave from the ministry and becoming a bartender for a while. And while I was a bartender, a community organizer got a hold of me named Felipe, who is undocumented and queer. And Felipe said, I'm going to make a community organizer out of you. And he became one of my teachers and led me on a different path of ministry that ended up taking me to Chicago to do work around LGBTQ equality and inclusion, which took me into places like, Ferguson after Michael Brown was murdered, and in other places. I kept on my journey and eventually decided to give the church one more try and came back, became pastor of Allendale. And with the question of what if I led in a way that we did the right thing no matter what, and we were a community organizing church, and we were primarily concerned with those who were on the margins. What would church look like if we led in that way? And that's what we've been creating for the last 4 years. We get to be in partnership with awesome organizations like Community Tampa Bay. So I'm honored and privileged to be here.
Thank you so much. Thank you for sharing that perspective. There's so much. I feel like we have known each other well, and yet there is so much of your background that I had no idea about. So thank you so much for sharing that. I wanted to talk to you. Like we chatted a little bit about what this conversation was going to be about, right? And I want to talk a little bit about. I want to start with COVID-19 and then move to anti-Black racism, right? And with COVID-19. We saw a lot of things taking place in terms of the economy closing for all the right reasons, so on and so forth, and different people being impacted in different ways. And there were certain things that were happening with different faith organizations in terms of how they handled COVID-19, right? And what leniency the governor was providing around that. What is your take on that?
Well, I mean, immediately we knew that our primary job is to love our neighbor. And so the way that we lived out in the midst of a pandemic is one, to not hold in-person worship services. We started doing immediately going online, and we will remain online for the foreseeable future, possibly until there's a vaccine. We'll see how things go. And then we wanted to take care of those who are suffering. And we opened up a fund, which people have generously given almost over $25,000 to. And we have been helping people that have been struggling financially. We didn't want to do it in a way that was going to repeat some mistakes of our past in ways that we would, we wanted this money to be liberating for people and not be more confining. And so if people expressed to us a need, we sent them a check for $1,000. for whatever they needed. Many of them had children they needed to feed or houses they had to keep over their head. And then also we concerted a lot of our energies into coming alongside people that were experiencing threats from their landlord.
Mm-hmm.
You know, there's been a stay by the governor on evictions, but that hasn't stopped landlords from getting creative. And in one community in Orlando, a landlord threatened to tow a woman's car. He couldn't evict her, but he was going to tow her car, which would have just wreaked havoc on her. She's already struggling, and it just would have snowballed into more struggles. And so we made sure that, and guess what? After and the news got a hold of it, the landlord backed down. And so we're trying to, you know, with the onslaught of the avalanche of evictions that are coming when the stay ends, we're connecting those people with with lawyers, and trying to help many of them get their money together for their rent. But there's endless, if we just keep looking, there are endless opportunities of people suffering where we need to step in as a faith community and help do the right thing.
Heard. I know that a lot of what we've observed during COVID-19 is that, you know, while we see on a regular basis, we see discrimination taking place. We know that it is systemic. We know that it exists in multiple communities. We know that it exists in multiple institutions. Andy, are you able to see me? So as y'all can see, Andy has left the building temporarily. And there we go. He is coming back right now. So what I was saying previously was,
right here.
you know, through the work that we do, we see a lot of discrimination on a regular basis. And then when COVID-19 happened, we saw discrimination, systemic discrimination, just the manners in which systems are created, affecting different populations of humans differently, and some populations of humans much more aggressively than when we are outside of this global pandemic, right? How is the global pandemic affecting the humans that you typically work with?
You know, we're seeing, as you know, here in St. Petersburg, a disproportionate number of Black and brown people that are being affected by the pandemic, and of course, systemically, those that are being affected by housing and food shortages, and you know, other disparities around healthcare. Everything's compounded. It shows our disgusting underbelly of all the things that we've been placing, as Dr. Barber talked about, Reverend Dr. Barber talked about. We've been applying Band-Aids to the wounds of people, and instead of cleaning the wounds. And when you apply Band-Aids, you know, those wounds fester. And that pandemic has brought these wounds to the surface, and we are having to deal with that now as a culture, when we have been neglecting those that are on the margins.
Right. So now we're having to, I guess, finally figure out what the root cause of these problems are and work on them, as opposed to ignoring them and just fixing the symptoms and not the disease per se.
Right.
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 Right. Yeah. Well, Andy, I want to move a little bit and talk about leadership, right? Faith and leadership, both together and separately. So we do live in a country that talks a lot about the separation between church and state, right? There's significant conversation around that. And yet, from your work with, from my work with Community Tampa Bay, and, you know, some of the other activism work that I've been fortunate enough to do, and from your work within faith, but with the LGBT and with the LGBTQ plus community, there isn't often that separation when it comes to informing how policy is created, right? Where do you think the role of the church should come in, and where do you think the role of the church should end?
You know, we delve a lot into politics because, first of all, churches are allowed to be political. Politics is simply how we order our life together, how we decide our community is going to function. And for a church to be completely removed from political, or to oftentimes name specific things as political, such as racism, right? Oh, we don't talk about racism. Racism is political. No, we're talking about people's lives. And so we've seen over and over again the church be guilty of wanting to stay out of politics for the wrong reasons, naming that it's not our place to weigh in on transgender lives that are being harmed. We don't get into political stuff. And so we've taken the exact opposite approach, that it's not these people's lives that are political, but in many ways the conservatives in our government have politicized people's lives, whether they are undocumented or Black and brown people or LGBTQ people, or women wanting access to reproductive health care. They have politicized people's lives. And so it's important as a church that has a lens of liberation. Some would call us progressive. I like to think that we are focused on liberation of all people. And when we focus on the liberation of all people, not only are those on the margins liberated, but the oppressor is liberated as well in that work. We take at the center of that work people's lives and how they are affected. And so it is very much a political statement for us to say Black Lives Matter, and for us to put a Black Lives Matter flag in our church. Now, where I think that should stop in the church's role with the state, it is inappropriate for me to in a pulpit and tell my people who to vote for. But I certainly can advocate and talk about the issues that are important, like universal health care, like gun reform, like eradicating racism, like reparations. Those values that are important for me as a pastor to talk about. I preached a sermon just a couple weeks ago on why we need to defund the police and what that's all about. And so Jesus, who I follow as a Christian, was all about helping people to order their life in a way that was going to help them love their neighbor, that way that was going to care for what he said, the widow and the orphan, those that were the most marginalized. And that's at the center of the gospel. We also I follow Jesus, who was a brown-skinned man who was executed by the state, by police brutality. He was a victim of police brutality, of those who wanted to harp on law and order. And so it's my job to draw attention to that and say, this is what we have to be about. And I also know that we can only do that together. And so even though I come at this from a Christian tradition, I know that if I do it on the backs or at the expense of my Jewish siblings, or my atheist and agnostic siblings, or my Islamic siblings, then I am basically self-defeating my purpose. We have to all get there together, because your liberation and your well-being is tied up in my well-being. As Dr. King said, I can't be what I'm supposed to be until you're what you are supposed to be. And I have to give credit. I didn't start this way. I've been on a journey myself, and it is really Black women, womanist theologians who have taken upon themselves to be my teachers, to call me out who have written the work and done the labor. I am benefiting from their labor. And so I don't come here as an expert, but just someone that wants to come and share where they are in their journey, what I've learned, and how I'm leading my community.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing that, especially the fact that, you are too on a journey, right? So that brings me to my next question. Your sermons, I've been to some of them, right? So your sermons are very directly related to what is happening in communities right now. They don't, the ones that I've been to don't live outside of the world that we live in that current moment, right? And in seeing that, I suppose my question, I'm trying to phrase this question correctly in my mind as well. while people are drawn to Allendale because they feel it aligns with their values and how they, like you said, right, how they choose to live, to order their lives in a way that helps them love their neighbor, right? Um, how do you assist some of these humans who might have trouble going directly to defunding the police? You know, with that, with a concept that feels that daunting to them, right? Um, what words of wisdom do you provide them as they are on their journey to in defeating anti-black racism and recognizing that they themselves might perpetuate such racism and do in fact have the capacity to educate themselves and learn more and change the world?
You know, when I got to Allendale 4.5 years ago, I was involved in a doctoral program with Dr. Angela Kauser, a Black woman who was teaching me community organizing in the context of ministry. What would it look like for a church to become a community organizing church? What would it look like for me to be a community organizing pastor? And at the center of that, Dr. Kauser really impressed upon me that the work of anti-racism was the most important work for the church to be doing, that everything else that we are dealing with, all the other isms, live and come out of and breathe and get their life in white supremacy.
Mm-hmm.
And it is the church's lack of attention to that which has caused the church's downfall, and our culture's downfall. This was her thesis. And so if she could create the intelligence and the ability to be able to lead our people into really tough conversations about themselves, then her work would be done. And so I took that seriously, and from the very beginning, we've been focusing on the work of anti-racism. And the way that we've been doing that, because I didn't get to a church that was progressive. I got to a church that was pretty, your bell curve makeup of, probably looks a lot like Pinellas County, right? You had some people who were excited about this progressive direction and people that were really apprehensive and ready to go out the door, but mostly people in the middle that just never really thought about it before. And so the approach we took was to do a lot of deep, intentional listening. Listening would be important. And so if I'm the only voice speaking from the pulpit, that's problematic. Because as much as I can incorporate other experiences and traditions, I don't ever know what it's like to wake up Black. I don't ever know what it's like to wake up trans. And so having voices from the margins be at the center of our space and make it a... Did I freeze?
You froze, yeah. I can still hear you, but your video's frozen.
Come back up here. To have
Okay.
voice on the margins. Frozen again?
Frozen again.
Better?
Better, yeah. Keep speaking.
How about that? To have voice at the margins, at the center of our worship time, at the center of our tea time, was the way that we were going to transform as people. And so when I shared, that sermon 2 weeks ago on defunding the police, or when I've preached on white supremacy or white fragility, it's been very important for us to listen to the voices that are affected and to push back on our normal reaction, which is defensiveness as white people, and to take seriously that work that we have to do. But it also has to be, it can't just stay in book discussions that are, intellectually sitting around discussing these ideas and these concepts. It had to be coupled with action. And so showing up at actions, at protests, taking action ourselves when Marquise McLaughlin was not, his murderer was not being arrested. And so we spent a Sunday learning about nonviolent resistance, and then we marched outside and took over the intersection outside our church to demand Drake's arrest. that type of action that we had to live into, and also simple, smaller practices like when we started having our name tags and asking people their pronouns.
Right.
When we first started doing that practice, I had, I don't know, maybe a quarter of the church kind of back. Well, I don't need to put my pronouns on there until week 5 of this practice. We had a trans person that had come to church, been asked their pronouns. They identify, they use they, them, their, and they started to cry because they had never felt so welcomed in a church. They were scared to death walking into a church, and to have that be their first interaction was extremely. Sorry, am I frozen?
You're frozen, but I can still hear you.
It was extremely life-changing for them. And they gave testimony from the pulpit. They shared how transformational that had been to have people in a church community embrace pronouns. And what happened the next Sunday, just about everyone had pronouns. And now there's not a Sunday that goes by where I don't see everyone with their pronouns. And so we had some people where their belief hadn't caught up to the practice we were asking them to do. But when we did the practice and they saw the impact, their belief changed. And that's the work not only that we have to do inside the church, but then we are doing that to practice for how to change our community and our world.
That's incredibly powerful. And I'm sure it was incredibly powerful for the humans too, who, like you said, the practice that you were asking them to engage in didn't align with their beliefs, and then to have all of that suddenly align in such a short span of time had to be a very powerful, very transformative, powerful moment for them as well. Right. So you've talked a lot about how it is really important for the church to not only be involved in the education piece, but in the action piece as well. Right.
Mm-hmm.
Then I know that there are moments in the last very recent few years, I want to say maybe in the last year and a half, where you have been up to Tallahassee, right, to hold legislators accountable to discriminatory policy. Mm-hmm. And that has been not an easy journey for you as well, right? You've received quite a lot of pushback for the work that you've done. I believe you could receive quite a lot of pushback for an invocation that you gave. You regularly receive a lot of pushback for the board that's outside of your church and the statements that you make in that space. Right? Can you tell us a little bit more about why it's important for you to continue doing that, no matter how much trouble you get in?
First I'd like to say the pushback or the I'll wait till I'm.
There you go. I think.
First I want to say that the pushback that I get, or the nasty or phone calls that we get, whatever, is a microcosm of what people on the margins experience every day of their lives. Okay, I am never going to claim hood or anything, because when I get to choose, when I wake up in the morning and choose that day if I'm going to be in radical solidarity with people at the margins, and when I choose to do that, I experience a tiny bit of the hate that gets directed at people every day. I have to keep my perspective straight that the two are not equal. Okay. And I'll also say that the positive feedback we get outweighs the negative 1,000 to 1. And so that also gives me hope. But yeah, it's important no matter the pushback. I practice what I think of as ministry without fear. And I think a lot of clergy are fearful, or a lot of leaders, community leaders, are fearful of, if they're like me, using their privilege, because it may mean that people are going to leave their church, or people are going to get upset. They want people to like them. Or I often hear the phrase, oh, I have to be pastor to all the church, right? And that ends up watering down their work into the least common denominator, which means they don't say shit. And it's playing it safe like that. When I have chosen to play it safe, it has always been at the expense of Black and brown people, or LGBTQ people, or, you know, people on the margins. And so I have been radicalized by my experience in solidarity with people on the margins, to live into a different way of doing ministry, so that come what may, is cast with theirs. And it's crucial, especially when the pushback is coming, because again, that is emblematic of pushback, that this is something we have to push on. When we've put up marquees about white supremacy, and I'm talking about before these last 2 weeks, we've been doing it for the last 4.5 years, the white supremacy signs always get the most pushback. And that tells me that it's at the core, at the center of all this other hate that lives out there. And until we stand up and say no, and do the work to dismantle it, it's going to continue.
100%. So, folks, I specifically asked Andy this question because I think it is important to hear. Like, I can preach about dismantling white supremacy all day, and I can not preach, that's not the word I wanted to use. I can talk about dismantling white supremacy all day, and I can, you know, as a marginalized human, I can talk about my experience being marginalized. But I think it's really important for other white folks and non-marginalized folks, or white folks primarily, to hear from someone who's both white and Christian and a cisgender man, of how you perceive your own privilege in comparison to others, and how you weigh and rationalize that, right? And realize that you have a good amount of privilege that you can use to better your communities. And like you said, being safe more often than not indicates that you're not saying much of anything, right? So we're going to move on to a question. And folks, if you have any questions, please feel free to post them in the comments. We have a question here that says, for folks awakening, can you hear me? Okay, you were frozen for a second. Are you good now?
Yeah, I can read. Go ahead and ask about.
For folks awakening or struggling to directly or genuinely reach people in their lives, how do you deal with being direct without coddling?
So I really appreciate this question coming from Set. Set is a good friend and an important part of Allendale community. And this was a skill I definitely had to grow in. You know, how do you be direct without coddling? For me, it meant living into my role, my call. Part of my call is speak truth to power, to comfort those who, and to disrupt those who are comfortable. And so when I preach a tough message or give a tough teaching, oftentimes you can see by people's behavior, especially those that are part of the community, right? They're a little bit slower to get there. They may say something to me or reach out. I spend extra time with those people and listen to where they are and help them feel heard. A lot of times their trouble is coming out of a place that has nothing to do with what was talked about. It's coming out of a place of feeling replaced, or their power is disappearing, or they're not feeling as important anymore. And so there's a way of listening, but holding true to truth, that I have seen people grow. I'll give an example. early in the church, 4 years ago, we did a study called America's Original Sin. I think I'm frozen again here.
We can hear you though.
And it was about racism in the church. And who spent the first 5 weeks coming to class and pushing back every week, challenging everything that was in the book. You've met those white people before. Many of them live on Facebook. And we kept at it. And I would check in via phone call and that sort of thing to keep coming. And then week 5, he did his reading and he came. I realized I was around people that just look like me. And it has caused a lot of harm, not only to myself, but to other people. And so confession was step 1 of that. And then changing their life has been a journey since. The following week, I believe it was Tamir Rice was shot. And he said to me, he said, if I hadn't been doing this work, this internal work, now, granted, this is a guy who's almost 60 years old. If I hadn't been doing this internal work, I would not have understood correctly what's happening in our world. And so the work that I'm doing is helping me. I was just saying that taking time to do people who don't get it, but who are willing to journey has been one of the most rewarding parts.
Right here, heard watching that transformation, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm hearing a lot of listening, a lot of providing space, and at the same time, not shying away from accountability.
Not shying away from accountability, correct. And stepping in and interrupting if harm is being done. Okay. If someone is harming someone, that's not a time for any type of patience. It's my job and our job to step in and stop it and interrupt it. Learning can happen later. There's no excuse because they were born in a different time or whatever. If they're causing harm, it needs to immediately be interrupted.
Right. So a time for harm that's not a learning, that's not a teaching moment.
Right.
That's an actual interrupting moment. Heard.
Right.
Heard. So Seth is also a huge part of the Anytown and the community, Tampa Bay community. So it's nice to see both those worlds intersect. And that was a fantastic question, because I know that with CTB2, right, we've been trying to figure out individually, we are all doing the work, right, in our own lives and in terms of how we participate in dismantling anti-Black racism as a system, and then as an organization, especially with this long overdue uprising that has happened and all of these and now like hardcore accountability happening because of the people, which would never have happened otherwise, right? Like you pointed out with so many cases. If the level of public involvement hadn't taken place in highlighting and making sure that the injustices are being shared and called accountable to, so many things might have stayed the same, right? But now we're seeing the manner in which this movement is rising and building further and further, and it has been for a long time, but the momentum with which it has been taking place over the last, 2.5 weeks, right, is very different from what we are used to, so us too, we've been trying to find our place in what is the best way in which we can support, what is the best way in which we can ally as an organization, what is the best thing that we can do. And so that brings me to my next question for you is, like you said, Allendale has constantly been working on dismantling anti-Black racism and white supremacy. What has changed for you in these last 2 weeks, and how?
I am grateful that we didn't just start talking about this 2 weeks ago. As a community at Allendale, we would be in a lot of trouble if, and that's the boat a lot of people are in their churches. They're just now starting to talk about this. And I'm grateful that we had done the work prior. It enabled us to do the work on a deeper level. than if we were just starting to from scratch. And
Right.
so some of the things I've been able to do because of that is, for example, preach entire sermon on defunding the police, right? That's not something I would have recommended myself 4 years ago doing.
Mm.
And we were starting from a different place and being able, and some of the things is just seeing the reaction of my community, knowing that it's important, one, for us to take action. So it's important for us to choose from Black and brown organizers. So it do harm for Allendale to go out and lead an action ourselves that is outside of the strategy of how Black and brown, Black people specifically, are trying to achieve their liberation. It's also not our job to be judgmental of how people are trying to achieve their own liberation. And so we're not going to get involved in tone policing, phrases like defund the police and abolish the police. We're not going to be the ones out there, trying to, tell people that this is really marketing. In fact, I've seen people be on the opposite end of that, to remind people that this conversation's been happening for several decades. Read some Angela Davis. Read a lot of Black women who have been using this phrase, using these phrases and leading this. You are arriving late to it doesn't give you the right to now critique it.
Right.
Approaches we've taken over the last 2 weeks. We did start a book study. The Washington Post had a great op-ed by a Black man who in Black communities, white people take up book clubs. To explain that, yeah, we need to do book studies and we need to learn, and we need to learn the language and be better and perfect our work. At the same time, it can't stop and end. This book has to lead us deeper and greater. And so that's some of the work we've been doing over the last 2 weeks.
That's excellent, fam. That's really, really solid. Well, folks, if y'all have any other questions for Pastor Andy Oliver, please go ahead and post it in the comments. I am running up to my final question. This has been such an excellent conversation. I appreciate, all the insight that you've offered in terms of not just your own perspective, but also your approach in general to leadership and how people should be approaching what Black liberation can look like, and how leadership must come from Black humans in the Black community, and we must follow the marginalized communities that we are serving, as opposed to trying to lead them, when really we are not. If we don't share identity with them, then we shouldn't even be trying to do that, because that's just stepping out of our lane.
Yeah, I cringe anytime someone suggests that I'm a voice for the voiceless, or if they say that themselves. People on the margins have a voice. I just need to shut up. I need to listen. I need to pass the mic. I need to give up the pulpit. I don't need to be at the center of this. I need to be the one listening.
Exactly. So listening is such a huge piece of that educational aspect. Also really loved what you said about just because you're joining the conversation now does not mean the conversation has not been happening forever. So literally a lot of people have about 400 years of conversation to catch up on.
Yep.
So listening would be a wonderful skill to employ in this current moment. Right?
Yeah, I think all of this stuff carries a both and with it, right? And so I think also to speak up, listening and speaking up, and not speaking up. Okay, we're back. Not speaking up as a white until you feel like you can do it perfectly is an element, is a tool of white supremacy. And
Right.
so the practice of deep listening, of learning with each other, of speaking up, of making mistakes, of hearing feedback and doing better is the continual work that I'm urging my people to be doing.
That's boss. That's really neat. So my last question for you, and we'll see if some folks have some questions as well. My last question for you is, we are at this very pivotal moment right now. What are some words that you would like to offer fellow humans for whom, you know, faith is a huge part of their lives, no matter what faith they're part of, right? Faith is a huge part of their lives, or they might be faith leaders themselves, right? What are some words that you would like to offer to such humans who are, you know, colleagues of yours, peers of yours, looking to you for words on how to proceed? What are some of the things that you would like to say to them in terms of action and engagement and heart, I suppose, in this space?
I guess one thing that what I've learned on my journey, that if your faith and the way you're practicing it is leading to bondage instead of liberation, if it's not leading to liberation, then you may not be practicing it right. And so trying to surround yourselves with faith communities or other humans, you know, that are utilizing the practices that you use to connect to each other and to something else, that are leading to practices that lead to liberation. And so many people, I think, are wrapped up in faith traditions that are leading into the opposite of liberation. And I just don't think that's what our faith practices are about.
Right, succumbing to faith practices with the idea of liberation for everyone.
Yeah.
That's a great goal to have. Just liberation. You know, that's such a fantastic goal to have, to approach, I think, not just faith, but everything that we do in our lives, leading to that space. So fam, if I would strongly recommend, I don't identify as Christian. I identify as a spiritual human. I don't necessarily identify with any faith, but I have been to many of Pastor Andy Oliver's sermons and have been so fortunate to be able to be there. And they're very powerful. And if you are, and I'm going to say this, if you are and you should be social justice inclined, because a lot of change needs to happen in our schools and communities to ensure liberation of all of our humans. Like Andy said, it's a good space if you are looking to acquire some wisdom, if you are looking to acquire some motivation, if you are looking to self-reflect and question your own understandings of where you are coming from in your faith and spirituality. One of Pastor Andy Oliver's sermons is a great place to start. So thank you so much, Andy. Any other questions, folks, that you all have for this wonderful human? Well, you should have a lot of support.
I appreciate it. I'll echo the words of Seth there in the comments. Whatever your background or belief, all are welcome. That's in our statement of you know, that centers us at Allendale. And I'll say one of the fastest growing pockets at Allendale are people who identify as atheist and agnostic, because they want to still be a part of this work of liberation and social justice. Even one Sunday, one of them preached from the pulpit a sermon on the Lord's Prayer, and it's the best sermon on the Lord's Prayer I've ever heard. We need everyone. We need everyone to be doing this work, and so everyone's welcome, and you know, you're welcome here no matter what. So again, I want to thank you, Sam, for the amazing work that Community Tampa Bay is doing, and I really think a lot of y'all, and especially the work you do with young humans.
Well, thank you so much for all the space that you provide for our young humans. I know every single time that we've brought young humans to your space, they've always felt very safe and secure and welcome. And a lot of our young humans have not felt very safe in the religious spaces that they've previously occupied. So it is both a new and an incredibly affirming experience for them to be in a space like Allendale. So thank you for providing that space.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Andy. Thank you, everybody, for having joined us on this Creating Space with Pastor Andy Oliver. Much love to you, fam. I'm sure I will see you out there doing the work that we do. Thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Bye.
Have a wonderful day. All right. Bye-bye. Folks, thank you all so much for joining us. I always appreciate all of your support, all of the questions that you ask. The fact that you know so many of the humans that we bring on here just goes to show how tight our community is. We would love to hear from you about what you think we should be doing, what you think we should be improving upon. We are launching constantly, different programs as our community requires it. We're living in a very different time where being static in the work that we do, stagnant in the work that we do, does not serve the people that need us the most. And so we are trying to be as fluid as possible and provide as many resources as we can for humans to engage with us and with others who are doing this work as well. So I would be ever so grateful if you would fill in a survey that either one of my colleagues is going to post on here in this moment in the comments, or you will find as well on our social media. I would be ever so grateful if you could fill in that survey and let us know what you think about the work we are doing, what you think we could be doing differently. If there are other guests that you want to recommend for us to bring on board, we would absolutely love to hear from you about other leaders. There we go. My summer AmeriCorps Vista, the wonderful Ashley, coming through with our Survey Monkey link. So let us know what you think. Let us know where you would like us to be, what you would like to see. And we will do our very best to provide, because that is our primary purpose, is to bring to you the spaces that you need to have, the conversations that you need to have. So thank you all so much for being here. This is Creating Space. We will be back on Tuesday again at 2 p.m. Thank you all. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.